Russia has turned up the heat on Ukraine and Europe, vowing to seize Donbass via talks or by force. Now, Putin has warned European leaders against meddling in peace talks. Europe is preparing against any future threat, and its leaders are meeting for a make-or-break summit on using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. While the plan to use Russian assets to strengthen Kiev's hand faces opposition from within, Belgium is firmly opposed to it, fearing financial and legal reprisals from Moscow. Italy has also warned that finding a legal way to use frozen Russian assets to help finance Ukraine will be far from easy. Italian Prime Minister Meloni has also ruled out sending troops to Ukraine. This is after any future peace deal. The European Commission plan is into some 210 billion euros of Russian central bank assets frozen in the bloc. The scheme would initially provide Kiev 90 billion euros over 2 years. At first, the funds will be loaned to the EU, which will then loan them to Ukraine. Kiev would then only pay back the reparations loan once the Kremlin coves up for all the damage it has wrought. Belgium, where International Deposit Organization Euroclear holds the vast bulk of the funds, is yet to back the plan. Russia has already announced that it is suing Euroclear, but EU officials say that they have gone out of their way to allay Belgian worries and offered multiple layers of protection, and this includes guarantees from other member states. US and Russian officials are set to meet in Miami this weekend to discuss Trump's peace plan. Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner are expected to take part on the US side, while Putin's economic envoy Kirill Dmitriev is set to be from the Russian delegation. Ukraine has said that Washington is also pressuring the EU not to use the assets as they view them as a vital bargaining chip in winning over Russia. But EU officials deny that. EU estimates that Ukraine needs an extra $159 billion to stay afloat over the next 2 years, with the cash crunch set to start in April. European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also stressed the urgent need for the EU to decide on financing support for Ukraine over the next 2 years. Now, she also said that Europe must be responsible for its own security.
Europe's era of independence must be unstoppable. And we have more work to do. We have to go further. We must move swiftly. And that is particularly important when it comes to security and defense. The bottom line is simple. Europe must be responsible for its own security. This is not longer an option. This is a must.
Meanwhile, the UK's military chief has urged his countrymen to be more prepared against rising military threats. Chief of the Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, said that a whole-of-society response was needed, including an increase in regular forces, cadets and reserves. However, he suggested there was only a remote chance of a direct Russian attack on the UK, but warned against so-called hybrid attacks. And to unpack this further, joining us on the broadcast is defense and security expert Dr. Glenn Deason. We also have with us Dr. Sergei Sumleny. He's a defense expert and director, European Resilience Initiative Center. Thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Deason, let me come to you first. We know that Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton warns that the UK faces one of its most dangerous security environments due to Russia's growing military threat. Now, the question that needs to be probed is Europe next?
Well, I would say yes and no. When these statements are made, they never explain why. That is, why would Russia attack Europe and risk a direct war with NATO? Again, over the past 11 years, they've gone to great length to exactly avoid this and limit the war to Ukraine. Now, the unspoken assumption is often that Russia's just aggressive, expansionist. They might want to march on Berlin or Paris. But once you say this out loud, it does sound ridiculous, which is why they never explain why Russia would attack. But the message, of course, is to prepare the public for war. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a growing likelihood for war. I do think it's very likely we'll see a major war in Europe because, as we see, the Ukrainian army isn't doing very well, militarily, economically, politically. So I think two things will happen as a result of the Ukrainian army beginning to fall apart on the battlefield. Is first the losing side, which is the NATO countries. They must escalate dramatically in some way to rescue the situation, so more direct involvement in attacks on Russia. Meanwhile, the winning side, which is the Russians, they would likely become more overly confident and even bold. So they might also take actions which could escalate also further. Indeed, we already see much more brutal attacks now on Ukraine. But at the minimum, at least, the Russians would likely draw new red lines in the proxy war. For example, NATO drones flying over the Black Sea. It wouldn't surprise me if they are now beginning to be shut down, because they're the one picking targets for which Russian targets they should strike. So I think we're likely to go up the escalation ladder very soon. So for this reason, I think that a major war in Europe now is more likely than not. But a lot of the assumptions being presented, they're never unpacked again. Why? Because it doesn't really make any sense the way they're trying to sell this war.
Right. We hear you, Dr. Deason. Now, Dr. Simlane, let me come to you. Would you agree with that assessment? Could the chances of a Russian attack on Europe be well-founded, in your opinion?
Well, I hear this question like, why should Russia attack someone? Ukraine, the Baltics, other countries, they have no interest for that. That's why they will not attack pretty often. I had the same discussion in early 22 before the full-scale invasion, and my good friend, who I respect a lot, he used the same arguments that, like, why should Russia attack Kiev? It would lead to sanctions. The Russian army cannot take Ukraine by force. Ukrainian army is trained for 10 years. They have got like new equipment, etc. The motivation is high. It will end badly for Putin. Still, Putin attacked. We have in history a lot of examples when dictators started wars they couldn't win. Japan could have never won against the US. They still have attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler could never win against the whole world. He managed to attack the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and dragged the United States into war. Like, why should he have done it? Still, he has done it. If we look at Russia's action, they always act out of different logic, different to our logic. They calculate not the risks for them, but the weakness of their opponent. And they think that they can scare their opponent and force the opponent into paralysis and inaction. And when we look at the attack against Ukraine in 2022, they believe that the Ukraine will fail because of fear and because of internal treason. And looking at Europe, they think the same. They clearly think that Europe is unable to act decisively, that Europe is too lazy, too fat, to stick in peace, too divided. And that's why they believe that they will be able to crush Europe without a full-scale confrontation, but by just military pressure. And the moment when Russian soldiers appear on the border, the Europe will fail. That is their plan. And if we look at their media, what they tell to themselves and what they talk to themselves amid their meetings, they're in full delusion. Like, listen to what Putin has said recently at his meeting with generals. He stated that Russia had occupied larger Ukrainian towns in this year. None large Ukrainian town has been occupied. Still, he believes it, and his generals believe it. They have proclaimed victories they have never achieved. They believe they're strong. They believe Europe is weak, and that makes them dangerous, because they can start this war just because they believe they can win it.
Right, and either way, Europe is preparing against any future threats, and its leaders are meeting for a make-or-break summit. And of course, the point of contention is also using the frozen Russian assets for Ukraine, which has somehow divided Europe internally as well on many points. Now, how do you anticipate these talks leaning? Which way do you think the talks are going to lean now?
Or is it a question for me?
Dr. Deason, why don't you start with this?
Well, it remains to be seen. Again, I think that because the reason why we have a war to begin with is the security competition. That is, Ukraine has reasonable security concerns for Russia now, obviously, after the invasion of Ukraine. So for this reason, they would like to have security guarantees and a powerful deterrent to not have a future Russian invasion. But the Russians also have legitimate security concerns. They consider NATO in Ukraine to be an existential threat. So how do you resolve this dilemma? And there's no good solutions. And this is why I think the closer the Americans get to the European and Ukrainian position, the further they are away from Russia. The closer you get to Russia, the further away they go from the Ukrainian and European position. So there is no easy way to bridge this gap. So I think given that the Russians are winning, the logical thing is that Trump would likely at the end of the day put more pressure on the Ukrainian and European side, which we've seen before. But of course now he tends to flip-flop back and forth in order to put pressure on both sides. But the latest talks we've seen now in Berlin, it seems like this is beyond anything that would be acceptable to the Russians, because again the Russians invaded because they don't want to see NATO using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Yet the proposal they came up with is this 800,000 strong Ukrainian peacetime army with European troops and God knows armed to the teeth with what kind of missiles. So for them this would be another Minsk agreement, time to rebuild a Ukrainian army which can be used against Russia in the future. So if you want to prevent a major war, prevent the destruction of Ukraine, a peace agreement should do the opposite. It should try to reduce the security competition. That is, find a way of reducing Russia's security threat to Ukraine, but also the other way around. And I think for this to be achieved, we have to move a little bit away from the idea of simply deterrence, that one side will be overwhelmingly more powerful than the other in order to have peace, and instead find a way of, again, reducing this security competition. So for this reason, I think this is a non-starter. The Russians are not going to, by any stretch of the imagination, accept this. I think what the Europeans are hoping is that Trump will get on board with this agreement, and then when the Russians say no, the Americans will try to put sanctions or increase military pressure on Russia, and then they will be able to pull the Americans deeper into this proxy war. So I think this is the calculation, but we're nowhere close to a peaceful end to this.
Right, and while there's no dearth of obstacles that can hinder resolution, but to wrap up this conversation on a slightly optimistic, rather cautiously optimistic note, Dr. Samleni, what are the chances of the conflict ending in 2026, if there is any? And even if that happens, what would peace even look like?
I don't believe this war will end in 2026. Russia has no intention to stop the war, and this war has been started by Russia. Not by anyone, by Russia. Russia has started this war, and Russia can stop this war either by peacefully withdrawing their troops from Ukraine and paying Ukraine compensation for the damages caused, and giving Ukraine security guarantees, the real one, like demilitarization zone on the Russian side, reduction of Russian forces, etc., etc. Russia would never do this by goodwill, or Russia should be defeated. Otherwise, the war will continue. Russia has never hid their plans to go further. If you listen to the speeches of Russian generals, if you read Russian media, if you listen to Russian politicians, they won't take Ukraine, they won't rebuild their army, they won't go further to the NATO. They believe that their army, well trained now in Ukraine with their allies like North Korea, China, Iran, who send troops like North Korea and China, send troops to Ukraine to train them as well, that combined forces can crush the West, and that the U.S., if they neutralize the U.S., Europe will fall to their feet. That is their plan, and you can change nothing in that logic.
Right, we hear you, Dr. Samleni, of course. Now, let me rephrase the question slightly for you, Mr. Deason. What would it take Russia, what would it take for Russia to end the war in 2026?
Well, they will likely either end this by a military victory or diplomatic victory. Either way, what they want is to restore Ukraine's neutrality. This also means to get the Western intelligence services out of Ukraine, which more or less entered on the first day after Yanukovych was toppled. And they also want this territorial concession, as the Russians now lay claim to these 4 oblasts in addition to Crimea. So this is what they want. This is what they will demand in a diplomatic settlement. I think Donbass they will not negotiate on. I think the administrative or borders of Zaporozhye and Kherson, they might be willing to make compromises in terms of the size of the Ukrainian army. They're willing. There's always room for discussion, but of course not 800,000. And of course the money has to be returned to Russia. I think this is the minimum demands. So if they can't achieve this through diplomacy, I think that the war will simply continue, and the Russians are banking on the likelihood of the Ukrainian army collapsing, or the political leadership unraveling, or just going bankrupt, running out of money, which is what the EU is now trying to prevent by finding a way of legalizing the seizure of these Russian assets. So I agree with my Ukrainian colleague here. I don't think it's necessarily going to end in 2026. I think the major war there will come some kind of a collapse. Likely, not sure. I mean, the Ukrainians have fought much harder than anyone had predicted. So, but that being said, I think this can't go on for much longer. But given that the Russian demands are so high, and it can't really be met without being met with a lot of grievances, not just in Ukraine but also in the West, it wouldn't surprise me if we would see some guerrilla warfare or the war taking on a different format, at least beyond 2026.
Right, Dr. Deason, we hear you, and those were some very valid points there. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how the situation develops. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your valuable perspective with us.